Okay, so we are going to pick up on the developmental chapter to talk about Jean Piaget. We've already talked about development up to from conception to birth, going through attachment and language development. And now we're going to talk about a very specific psychologist's theories on cognitive development in children. Now, there are other developmental psychologists and other theories that we really aren't going to get a chance to get to. For example, Erickson and Kohlberg all have really good theories about development, but unfortunately, just for sake of time, we're not able to get to all of those. But the good thing is that you can take other developmental classes here on campus past this since this is just an introduction course. We're just kind of giving you a bit of a taste on some of the theories, but you can certainly look into more of those theories. For example, Vygotsky has some really good information about different stages of life. And so we're going to focus on Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget is a Swiss psychologist who really focused on four distinct cognitive stages that move from basically birth, infancy to adolescence. And so there are other psychologists who have developmental theories that cover the whole span of life, and some of them focus more on later life, some of them focus more on adulthood. Jean Piaget was mostly interested in children, and so this is why you'll see that the majority of the stages really that he's written about take place all the way through adolescence. So what set Jean Piaget apart from a lot of the other psychologists and scientists was that he really believed that children were little scientists. He didn't believe that children were passively soaking up information in the corner, just so happen to be getting it because they're there and they're quiet. But Jean Piaget said that they actively explored their world. And a lot of what his theories came from were careful observation of individual children and even his own children to kind of understand what children were capable of at different ages. And so we're going to talk about his stages, and we're also going to talk about some critiques of his developmental theory later on in just a little bit. But first, let's get started in the different stages. So the first stage that Jean Piaget wrote about was the sensorimotor stage, and this goes from birth to toddlerhood, which is about 2 years of age. And so what he described was that children really get their information from doing things like putting toys in their mouths and exploring with their senses, exploring by touching. If you ever take a 2-year-old into a store, chances are they're going to want to put their hands on everything. And if you give a toy or an item to a baby, chances are they're going to put that thing in their mouth. And so they're just trying to understand the world around them. Children really do have basic understanding of things like gravity and physics. If you do something even to a young child where you kind of defy the laws of gravity, so drop a ball and the ball is suspended in the air, they're surprised by that. They've learned long enough, they've been on the earth long enough to know that that's not right. And so they do understand basic concepts. Obviously, they can't explain it to you, but they do understand when things don't, when they don't look typical. Another thing that in this particular sensorimotor stage is that children really are able to perceive information and items. They're able to manipulate things, but they really they don't reason very well. You can't really reason with a young child. You can't take a 6-month-old and say, if you behave, if you behave right now, I'll give you a cookie later on. They just don't really understand that reasoning behavior and concepts. And so they're just kind of at the infancy in terms of understanding the world around them. And so one thing that we really see happening is that symbols start to become internalized through language. They're starting to understand that words mean things. They understand if I say mama, mama will come. If I say cookie, I get a cookie. They place meaning and symbols and all of that together to form their understanding of language. And so a child's comprehension between, infancy and 2 years is exponentially improving as they age, but is usually much better than their ability to produce language. So they're able to understand, basic instructions, but to be able to actually say what they mean, of course, they really struggle with production of language at this point. Now, Piaget was very particular about having milestones during each stage, and there are some important milestones for each stage that I think is important for you to know. One of the most important milestones in the sensorimotor stage is object permanence. And this is understanding that if something disappears from their view, that it really still does exist in the world. And so if a child understands object permanence and you hide a toy under a blanket, they will go after that toy under the blanket after you've hidden it. They understand it's there. They understand it hasn't disappeared from view, meaning it hasn't disappeared from the world. And it's really up to about 6 months of age that they don't understand object permanence. This is usually the reason why they have such a good time with peekaboo. When you hide your face, you're gone forever. And when you unhide your face, you have just performed the most amazing, disappearing voodoo magic act that they've ever seen. And so really young children really enjoy peekaboo because this is really exciting because they don't even know that you're gone. They don't realize where you went, and then suddenly you reappear, and that's really exciting. And then as they get older, so maybe a 9-month-old understands object permanence, but they enjoy peekaboo a lot of times because it's exciting. It's like a jack in the box. They don't know when you're going to pop back out, and it's really engaging for them. So peekaboo is one of those things that can be exciting for kids who both don't understand object permanence and who do. So that's a really important milestone during the sensorimotor stage that children should really to get, cognitively speaking. Now, as we move from toddlerhood to about 7 years old, now we're talking about the preoperational stage. And so this is when children start to really understand symbolic thought. They learn to play and pretend that one thing is something else. So they might pretend a pen is a sword, or a piece of styrofoam is a sword. And they engage in also something called deferred imitation. So what they're doing is they might watch you, observe something that you've done the day before or that day, and later on replicate that behavior. And so this is really, can be kind of scary because sometimes you don't realize that a child might be observing you and paying attention, but they usually are listening. And so sometimes they repeat what you say or repeat what you do. If you are, baking a cake in the kitchen, 2 days later they may bring you a pretend cake that they made for you. So it's a really fun kind of way that kids start to learn different roles and different behaviors. And later on, that's going to set them up to be able to replicate those behaviors even further. So maybe, they start out at 3 years old baking you a fake cake, and then as they get older, they actually learn to use those skills in the actual kitchen. So, it does set them up for learning behaviors later on. There are 4 important milestones that we're going to cover for preoperational. The first one is egocentrism, and this is really being able to understand that there are other people in the world, that there are, this is kind of, some think where empathy kind of starts, understanding that you're separate from others. So if you're egocentric, then you're not able to take another person's view. You're not able to understand that someone can't see what you see. And so we see this oftentimes if a young child is on the phone with someone, not a video chat, but just on the phone, they might try to show the person a toy or say, hey, look at this toy. And the person isn't able to see because they are, not in the room. And so the child doesn't really understand that they aren't able to see what they see and experience what they experience. And as a child starts to get older, they come out of this and become less egocentric. And they start to kind of see that there are other people in the world, and that there are other things, and that other people have other experiences. But there's a really good video on here where they test egocentrism. So there's a YouTube link at the end of the Piaget stages where a little boy is tested in terms of viewpoints. So he's asked to look at a little model, and then he switches with the experimenter, and she asks, "What can I see?" And so he doesn't understand that she can't see what he sees. And it's a really good example of egocentrism. Irreversibility is when a person can't reverse a sequence. Like if you take a 3-year-old and say, let's count to 4, and you go, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you ask the child, okay, now let's do it backwards. Let's count 4, 3, 2, 1. They're not able to do that on their own. So irreversibility is the inability to reverse things. If you say ABC, now let's do it backwards, CBA. They really can't do that on their own. Now, if you practiced with them and they learned it backwards, it's different. But being able to kind of go backwards in counting or letters or something like that, they're really just not able to do that yet. For centration, this is when you see a child really focusing on one thing. They're ignoring everything else. So I'll give you an example of this. I took my son to Disney World when he was about 2.5 years old. He was still really young, and we knew that he probably wasn't going to remember all of it, but he knew who Mickey was, and he had a really good time, and we spent lots of money. And after the trip, which we went to the actually meet Mickey and got pictures with Mickey. We went to eat dinner with Winnie the Pooh, or breakfast with Winnie the Pooh. He got to see all his favorite characters. There was a lot of big things that he was able to experience. When we got home, and his grandparents asked him, "Oh, wow, you went," he called it Mickey's house. "You went to Mickey's house. What did you do?" All he could talk about was this pair of red sunglasses that we bought in a visitor shop, just a little junk shop at Disney World. It had nothing to do with anything of the experience, nothing to do with Mickey, nothing to do with the rides and the food that he had, and meeting all these characters. All he could focus on were these red sunglasses that he got, and he was so excited about them. So he ignored everything about the trip and focused only on these sunglasses that he got. And so it was really frustrating for us because we wanted this experience to be, a fun thing where he could talk about this and remember it. And so he really focused on just the one. So centration is that tendency to really focus on one part, ignore everything else, and just get kind of caught up on that. Now, conservation, or conservation of mass, this is when if a child does not understand conservation, they don't realize that they don't understand a concept of mass. So if you, for example, have a child and you give yourself 2 cookies and you give them 1 cookie, and you ask the child, is this fair? Is this equal? The child will say no, and you'll ask why. And so if a 4-year-old, for example, might say, well, you have 2 and I have 1. Well, if you break their cookie into 2 parts, now that they have 2 halves and you have 2 cookies, if you ask them if it's fair, they'll say yes. They have 2 things, you have 2 things. They don't understand that their 2 things are actually halves and they make 1 thing. To them, it's sort of a quantity thing. You have this many, I have this many. If you were to take a glass of liquid, and so let's say you have a glass here, okay, and a glass here, and you put the same amount of liquid in both glasses. And then you say, okay, are they equal? And then the child will say yes. And then let's say you have a little skinny, a little fat glass, short fat glass. And then you take this liquid and you pour it in here. Well, because it's wide, okay, the amount of space it takes up is going to look different. So even though the child saw you pour the equal amount into this different glass, if you ask a child which one has more, or are they equal, A or B, they will say that A has more because it's a taller glass. So they don't understand that a liquid amount stays the same. They don't really grasp that yet. So conservation is when you understand that two quantities are going to remain equal, even if you change the appearance or you change the form or you rearrange something. And again, there's a really good video on here that shows this in a couple different ways, where you can see if the child understands conservation or not. So those are the four of the major milestones in the preoperational stage. And then as you move from 7 years old to really the beginning of adolescence, now we're talking about concrete operational. So this is the third of the four stages where children are really starting to understand logical thought. They aren't quite there yet, but they're getting to the point where they're starting to understand. They might classify and categorize things much more detailed and much more specifically. And so, like, for example, if they're very interested in dogs, they might know how to classify dogs even further, to breed, to type, things like that, if they're very interested in a certain kind of animal or a certain thing. They're also much less egocentric, meaning that they're starting to understand that there are other people out there with other experiences, and they, maybe want to help others. This might be a type, so you might see behavior like in a 9-year-old. You might see a 9-year-old walk down the street and see somebody who's homeless and say, well, why don't we pay for a meal for them, or why don't we give them something? Just really understanding and taking perspective and taking viewpoints that are different from theirs. Now, at this point, we're still seeing that children are not really able to reason abstractly. They're not really good with hypotheticals. So I've given this scenario in class before with my own son, who's right at the cusp of concrete operational. So I asked him a scenario. I said, I'm going to make up a rule. And I say that a feather, in my world, a feather can break glass. Okay, so if I have a sheet of glass and I hit the feather on the glass, it will break. And if I have a rock, okay, and I hit that with glass, it won't break. That's my rules. These are my rules. So I ask him, I say, what happens if I take a feather and I hit a piece of glass? And he answered, nothing will happen. So he didn't understand the hypothetical. He didn't understand the rules. Because to him, feathers are light, and of course they're not going to break glass. So the inability to really understand these special rules starts to form really past adolescence, to really understand hypotheticals and abstract reasoning much better. However, at this point, they do understand conservation of mass, and they're starting to really get to more complex thinking. Now, as the last stage of Piaget's stages, the formal operational stages where he ended, this is 12 years to adulthood. So at this point, he says, you've reached, in this point for childhood, your cognitive abilities and milestones. And at this point, you're seeing the logical thinking being able to happen, abstract reasoning. We're seeing hypothetical situations, children and adolescents really being able to understand that really past 12 years old. And things like, chemistry. So chemistry isn't really taught before 12 because children aren't really able to grasp abstract reasoning and thought. So for example, to be able to, even with models, okay, understand what molecular bonds are and say, okay, this is a representation of what water is, and these are the molecular bonds. We have 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen atom. To understand and apply that to what water is not easy, okay? And so some of these like sort of chemistry concepts, these aren't taught until later on because children aren't really able to understand and visualize that, or even with models be able to understand what that means. Now, one thing that Piaget would talk about and does happen is talking about cognitive abilities and how a lot of times they do emerge gradually. So you may see sometimes a child might get conservation of mass, for example. Remember, this is the concrete operational stage where they're really understanding it. You might see if a child's on the cusp, they're really starting to understand this. And, it might not be a light bulb moment. It might be just a period where they sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't, and eventually, gradually, they get the concept. Now, occasionally you do see kind of the light bulb moment, and this is when you actually see children really understanding a concept kind of quickly. And so it does happen. Where it can be a light bulb moment, but generally speaking, it's usually pretty gradual. Now, this is a nice breakdown of the different stages and a comparison of the two. This video right here, I highly, highly, highly suggest that you watch this for the quiz. This really gets into the experiments, the kinds of experiments where you test some of those milestones, and it kind of helps you visualize that. Now, if we talk about the strengths of Piaget's stages, it really did inspire a lot of study and development. He was one of the most prominent 20th century scientists, and this was a really, leading view in cognitive development. And fundamentally, the idea was accepted that infants, young children, and adults really do use distinctly different cognitive abilities to construct their understanding of their world. So this is a pretty fundamentally accepted idea. Or fundamental idea that was really accepted. Now, he did have some criticisms. For example, some said that he underestimated the cognitive abilities of infants and children, that they really were more capable than he believed. Also, another thing that Vygotsky was able to accomplish with his theory was this idea that social and cultural factors really do play a role in cognitive development. And this is something that Piaget really neglected in his views, in his theories. So there is a lot to be said about the social and cultural factors. For example, with egocentrism, we see certain cultures, like a more individualistic culture, a more American culture, children tend to be more egocentric, and thinking more of, kind of themselves, and they grow out of this as they get older. Whereas in other cultures, we see that they may not be as egocentric early on. That's just the nature of the culture and what we see in terms of, the community and the family is more important than the individual. So, this is important to consider, that there were criticisms of his views, but it really did lay the foundation for understanding cognitive development in children. So take a look at this video and make sure you know the difference between the stages. So moving from the Piaget stages into just, talking about other periods of development, adolescence is this period where sometimes we refer to as sort of teenagerhood. There's two terms here that I want to make sure that everybody understands. So adolescence is a period, right? This is a transitional stage or a period. And then we have adolescence, which is pronounced the same way. I'm just kind of talking about it weird. This is a people, right? So adolescents are like teenagers. So the period of time that they're going through is adolescence here, and then the people themselves, the teenagers going through it, are adolescents. So it sounds the same, but there are actually different spellings. Now, this is that transition period from childhood into adulthood that marks sexual maturity. This says, that the person is now able to reproduce. This is can be sort of an awkward stage for some kids as they're kind of moving through adolescence after that's been kind of initiated by puberty. Now here, what's really interesting, we're going to talk about this in a minute. Notice this insane height difference here. So these two kids are both eighth graders. They're the same age. But what we find is that girls tend to be about 2 years ahead of boys when it comes to sexual maturity and physical maturity. And so we're going to see this in the next few slides about how this progresses in terms of a timeline when puberty sort of begins. So, it's a good thing to keep in mind, and many of us have experienced this in school. You see kind of girls being the tallest ones in the class, and then a couple of years later, the boys catch up, and then they usually, are taller than the girls. Just a few major terms. Many of you probably already know this, but again, just wanting to make sure to reiterate. Puberty is that physical stage of adolescence that sort of triggers the adolescence where a person's going to reach sexual maturity, and they're actually physiologically capable of sexual reproduction. They may not be psychologically mature for it, but physically they can actually reproduce. And they reproduce with the primary sex characteristics. So these are those that are directly involved with reproduction. So for men, the penis and testicles; for women, the uterus and ovaries. That's really the bare bones of what you need to be able to reproduce in terms of sex organs. For secondary sex characteristics, these are all the sort of other things that can differentiate between a male versus female. For example, men's facial hair, women's breasts, but actually aren't necessary for sexual reproduction. And then here, this growth spurt, adolescent growth spurt, this is where we see kids hitting this massive growth spurt where they're gaining in height. They're also widening out. For girls, their hips are widening out. And for boys, their shoulders are broadening. And so we see a big weight gain and a height gain during this growth spurt. And here is just a breakdown of the sequence of puberty that we typically see. Notice for girls, starting about 9 when we see that increase in hormones, in sexual hormones, and then 10 in boys where we see an increase in hormones. But if you look at some of these ages, there's about a 2 to 3 year gap in some of these in terms of some of the milestones that are hit. And so for girls, the average age of first menstrual period or menarche is about 12 and a half, but this can vary. The onset of puberty and the timing of puberty can actually be affected by quite a few different things. For example, if there is no father in the home environment, girls will actually experience their menarche or first period at an earlier age. For boys, they tend to have accelerated physical development, so they actually hit puberty a little earlier. Genetics plays a role. So girls may experience their first period around the same age as their mothers did. So if a girl's mother experienced her first period at 11, then there's a good chance that the daughter will also experience her period around 11. For identical twins, if one identical twin experiences her period around 12 years old for the first time, there's a good chance that her identical twin will be experiencing her period around that same time. So we do know genetics are involved with timing. What you're eating, nutrition, if you're eating, foods that's kind of laced with a lot of hormones, that can change the timing of puberty. If you're eating really healthy food versus very fatty and junk food, that can affect it. If you're eating really bad foods for you and the child's obese, the child could actually begin puberty earlier than one who is at a healthier weight. And we also find that exercising excessively can delay menarche in girls. And so if you notice that a lot of times Olympic gymnasts tend to maybe 16, 17 years old, but may not have looked like they've actually hit puberty yet because, maybe they don't really have wide hips or that they don't have a lot of breast development. They might not have started their first period, or they have, but it's not consistent in terms of monthly cycle. Excessive exercise, so if you're exercising 4, 5, 6 hours a day, can actually delay puberty. And so it's important for some people, if they are experiencing a delay, to cut down on the exercise so that they can actually trigger puberty to allow their bodies to go through that progression. Okay. And so just because we see a girl, of course, starting her first period doesn't necessarily mean she's necessarily fertile yet. Usually about a year later, we're seeing the first ovulation or the release of that first fertile egg. But know that even in the first period, a girl can be fertile at that particular age. Now, what happens in the brain during adolescence? There's a lot of argument that boys and girls who are going through the teenager years and adolescence are just raging hormones, and that causes so much emotional strife and all that issue. And it turns out there's not a whole lot of scientific evidence for this. Yes, there are hormones that are increased, and yes, we see, yes, we do see changes in hormonal and brain activity, but it doesn't necessarily mean this is a storm or strife. A lot of times we see very well-adjusted teens. This kind of, and it's cultural as well in terms of what is expected of teenagers. If you expect teenagers to go and toilet paper people's houses and be ruthless and terrible, then they're going to act that way. If we make movies and put in social media and in the news and in our media that teenagers act a certain way, then they'll learn that that's the expectation and they'll act that way. It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in a lot of other cultures, the teenage years aren't really that different from the childhood years. And so we've learned that it's not universal for all teenagers to be kind of in this gloomy phase or anything like that. What's really interesting is that right before puberty, we actually see that there's a really large wave of overproduction of gray matter. And so these excessive connections will actually be shed or pruned off during puberty. And what we see is that this has this pattern. So if this is the frontal cortex here, and then here's the cerebellum in the back of the brain here, what we're seeing is that the pruning goes in this fashion. Okay, so we're seeing that the pruning, which is the shedding of the synapses that we no longer need in this brain here, the last part that is pruned off is the prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex is important for things like decision making, rational behavior. And so this actually doesn't happen. The brain doesn't become fully mature until about the mid-20s. So we're talking about kids, really 18, 19, 20-year-olds not having completely fully mature brains. And so the idea is that during this time that some teens may be making really poor decisions and might not be, thinking logically and maybe doing risky behaviors because their brains aren't fully mature. So this is actually rather newer knowledge that we've learned that kids, that teenagers really their brains really fully aren't mature. And that might actually change in the future some of our laws to understand, are these, is a 20-year-old making the right, who possibly made a poor decision, was it really their fault? So, just things to consider when it comes to brain development. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that when we consider social development during adolescence, when you test large groups of teenagers, what you find is that generally speaking, most teenagers get along with their parents. We do see a bit of a conflict increase, but this is healthy autonomy. This is teenagers saying, I want to be more independent. I want a later curfew, and they're gaining their independence. And of course, there's going to be a little conflict there because parents are going to be, maybe hesitant about giving up some of that giving them some of that independence. But generally speaking, most people report that they have a pretty good relationship with their parents. But we do find during this time that parents become less influential and peers become a bit more important in terms of the advice that they give, and then what teens are actually, who they're listening to is their peers, their friends. And so of course, parents hope that the friends that their kids pick kind of represent some of their values and how they try to bring their teen up, in hopes that they have good influences who are, surrounding their kids. And this is kind of scary here, is that, as kids get older, they are developing romantic relationships. That's going to influence their psychological development, their social development. And it does so both in a positive way, in a good way, and sometimes in a bad way. What's kind of scary is that we see by age of 12, about a quarter of adolescents are reporting that they do have a special romantic relationship, might be a boyfriend, girlfriend. By about 15, this jumps up to about half of adolescents, and then by 18, we're seeing about 70% of adolescents saying that they have been in a romantic relationship. So again, this can be a good thing, and sometimes this can be a bad influence. Now, what I have here, and this is a good place to kind of pause, I'd like for you to take a minute to read this. Now, this is an example of a moral reasoning experiment done by Kohlberg. And so this is kind of hard to do when I'm doing this sort of video or talk over lecture. But what I want you to do is I want you to think about, was it correct for the husband to do what he did? Should he have let, the situation pan out? Should he have decided to obey the law? What should he have done? And so I'm going to let you take a minute to pause and read this and really think about what you would have done and what you think he should have done. Now, when we look at Kohlberg's theories on moral reasoning, that was an example of something that he actually used, one of the many scenarios that he used. And he wanted to see how people thought about moral situations. What's ethical? What's not? Where do you draw the line? Do you say it doesn't matter what you do as long as you save a life? Do you sacrifice a life for someone else? What are your moral reasoning capacity? And so Kohlberg developed one of the most influential theories of moral development, and he actually created these distinct stages. And so there's been a lot of criticism behind these stages, which we're going to go over in just a minute. But he was able to make these distinct stages based off of the answers that were given in those scenarios, like the example that I just gave, and kind of felt, where did they fall in the moral development spectrum? And so the research doesn't really support Kohlberg's work. If you look here, he has 6 stages. So it goes up to 6 stages and 3 levels. Okay. And so most people actually fit in the first 4 stages. And so by adulthood, we're seeing that the conventional moral reasoning is really reflecting the importance of social rules and social roles. And so this level 2 right here is really, this stage 4 is really where we're seeing that the majority of people really falling into. So this post-conventional level here was one that isn't really super supported by a lot of research, and not all of Kohlberg's ideas behind the theory really actually are testable, or at least come out in the testing that was done. And we're going to talk about some of the issues with this kind of categorization in just a minute. But just looking at the pre-conventional. So the pre-conventional is where moral reasoning is guided by external consequences. So there's no internalization of rules or values. This is very like, you'll see young children tend to be at the pre-conventional level where, for example, stage 1 is just simply avoiding punishment. This is all about punishment and obedience. Right is obeying the rules just to avoid punishment because others may have power over you and may be able to punish you. Okay, mom said don't do this because she said don't do this. As you move up and go to stage 2, now we're seeing mutual benefit. So right is an even or fair exchange so that both parties benefit. And this is a kind of a fair play guided by fair play. Now, as you move out of pre-conventional and move into conventional, Stage 3, conventional in of itself is moral reasoning that's guided by conformity to social rules, conformity to social roles, conformity to expectations of society that is learned and internalized. And what I mean by internalized is that if you're driving down the road and there is no cop and no person around you, and there's a stoplight and it's red, you stop at that stoplight because it's red, with nobody watching you. You've internalized that rule and expectation, and you've said, even though no one's watching me, I'm still going to obey it. So at the conventional level, these rules, these expectations and social rules have been learned and have been internalized. Now at stage 3 here, what we're seeing is that right is being a good person by conforming to social expectations, for example, showing concern for someone else, following rules that are set forth to win approval of society and of people around you. As you move up to stage 4, now we're talking about right being helping to maintain social order. I'm doing my duty, I'm obeying laws because they are laws, and I'm showing respect for authority because they are authorities. So a lot of the research says that that most people end at the conventional level, and they're at the conventional level of moral development. Now, Kohlberg took it a step further. He said that there is actually the post-conventional level on top of this, where moral reasoning is guided by internalized legal and moral principles that protect the rights of all members of society. So this is kind of like a step above, saying, rules are rules, right? They're there, they're important, and I understand the principles, but there's more morality besides just following rules. So stage 5 would be, for example, legal principles. So right is helping to protect the basic rights of all members of society by upholding these legalistic principles that promote fairness, values of justice, equality, and democracy. And so this, again, is sort of a step above the conventional, okay? And then above this would be stage 6. This is the universal moral principles. Right is determined by self-chosen ethical principles that reflect a person's respect for ideals such as nonviolence, equality, human dignity. Even if these moral principles conflict with laws, the person's moral principles will take precedence. So this is almost what he would call a Gandhi-like step. He said, you are sort of above the law in some cases. You do what you need to do. You try not to, you say, I don't want to be violent, but, the law is unjust, and I understand that, and sort of moving up from that. Now, the problem is that these stage 6 especially gave critics a lot of trouble. They did not like this because they said that this universal moral principles were so rare. Another issue with Kohlberg's work was that just because you might have, maybe you landed on a stage 5 based off the scenarios, it didn't always predict moral behavior. So even though you might say, well, I am, at this level of moral development, and I would do this in this scenario, it actually did not predict moral behavior. Just because you said that you would do that doesn't mean you actually engage in that moral behavior. We're also finding that if you look back at the research, a lot of this research was based on men, and this was based on the Western perspective on rights and justice. So it didn't take into other cultures. So this is really dangerous to take this idea and say, we are going to apply this to every culture and every person because this is just our theory of moral development. Because a person might actually land lower here, not because they have a lower moral development or, they're lesser than, but just because of the kinds of scenarios and questions that they're asked, not taking into account culture, specific collectivist values, for example, religion, loyalty to family. It doesn't take into account any of that. And so it can be really dangerous to say, hey, this applies to everybody, because what this essentially throws out there is the potential of saying somebody might be lesser than someone else because they have a lower, they don't have as good as morals. And that can be really dangerous, where we can find a lot of lines being drawn that really shouldn't be. So again, just, this is a really interesting way to approach moral development, and it's a really good foundation for understanding it, but we need to understand that it doesn't apply to all cultures and doesn't apply to all people. Now, moving on from, adolescence and adulthood, we're looking at, moral development. Emerging adulthood is that particular age where we see a person moving out of adolescence and moving into adulthood. During this time of about 18 to the mid to late 20s, we're seeing that people are starting to explore things like relationships with others. They're exploring career choices. They're trying to figure out where they are. What social roles do I fit in? Who am I? We don't see identity really being fully resolved until after emerging adulthood, where we see about the mid to late 20s. And now, especially now, we're seeing that marriage is being postponed even later than it was years ago, because a lot of people are choosing to get their education first, establishing their careers, and then deciding to get married, and then later on deciding to start a family if that's the case. So we're seeing that marriage being postponed to the late 20s, even the 30s. Here, if you see 1960, so the green represent women. In 1960, we saw that the age of first marriage is about 20 years old. And for men, it was about 22.8 years old. In probably about 2012-ish here, we're seeing that women's age of first marriage is 26.6, whereas men's is 28.6. So we're seeing a pretty big leap here in terms of when people are getting married. And a lot of this is, finishing college or doing college, maybe even graduate school, establishing a career, and then moving on. And here you can see these statistics. About 26% of men, about 33% of women have earned a bachelor's degree in this 25 to 34-year-old age range. And that is actually much more than it has been in the past. Now, looking at development past emerging adulthood, just physically, you're seeing that your strength is really peaking in your 20s and 30s. That's that physical strength. By the time you hit your 40s to the mid-60s, which is middle adulthood, your physical strength will decline a bit, endurance declines a bit. You can see your mental reaction times also begin to slow, but this can actually be reduced by staying very active physically and mentally, and we see that decline really does decrease or happen more slowly with people who are very active. By late adulthood, which is mid-60s and on, we do see physical stamina further decreasing, reaction time further decreasing. Depending on how active the person is, you might see some loss of lean muscle, body fat will increase, metabolism changes, their bones may weaken, we do see a bit of cognitive decay. But remember that this is something that can be reduced with good activity, mental and physical activity. For women, menopause is that final milestone of no longer being able to reproduce. Men don't really have a sort of menopause episode where they no longer can have children. They can actually continue to have children into much later ages. But for women, and you can actually see early menopause starting in the 30s, but you see menopause generally happen between the late 30s to early 50s. Some it's a little bit later, but generally you see it happening in this age range. And so this is when this process's periods become more irregular, hormones start to fluctuate, and then eventually the periods will end, and then the woman is not able to conceive anymore. For men, we call this andropause. This isn't really an end to reproductive capacity, but it is a reduction in things like testosterone. They may have a reduced sexual motivation, in some cases erectile dysfunction, where they're not able to function properly, and of course there are medications to help with that issue. Now, if we look at the social changes that occur during adulthood, of course, we can talk about different stages, and there are different psychologists who talk about this. But one thing that is important is this idea of generativity. And so, in middle adulthood, one of the major things that people really focus on is just trying to contribute to future generations. And so you might do this through having children, raising your grandchildren, having a career, a combination of these things. It isn't necessarily just having kids. Of course, there are certainly meaningful things that you can do with your life without involving children. Engaging in meaningful activities, volunteering, having a career that contributes to society. All of these things can contribute to this psychosocial task of generativity. We do see that adults, especially as they age, have fewer friends than during the adolescent period. Women tend to confine more in one others, whereas men tend to like to do things together, like fish and things like that. Now, of course, the one sad thing is that we do have to talk about divorce rates, and about a little bit more than half of all marriages do end in divorce. But what this brings is the less traditional family, right? So we get the single parents, we get step families, blended families, half brothers, half sisters, and all sorts of combinations of different families that we can get with additional marriages. When looking at late adulthood and aging, many older adults live very healthy, active lives, self-sufficient, very high quality of life. It really depends on what you're doing with your life and what you're doing in terms of your regular, consistent schedule. Men's life expectancy in the United States is about 75 years, whereas women live to be about 80. A lot of times we see this cognitive decay or this decline in mental ability is a lot of times because of just they're not experiencing or practicing with their brain. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. It's the same kind of saying that we've been talking about this whole class. And so if the person is going to be more physically active and more engaged in mental activities, they're the ones who are showing the least declines and the least cognitive decay. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the activity theory of aging. And those people who maintain the same level of activity that they did in their early years, so maybe they're retired, but they're volunteering, or they're still involved with their career, or they're, physically very active, same sort of level of activity, they're reporting the highest quality of life, okay? They're the ones saying that they're, that they're feeling good and they feel healthy, and they're experiencing the least amount of cognitive decay. And of course, one thing that you have to consider in much later adulthood is if an older adult is starting to disengage or withdraw from different areas of their life, whether it be if they're volunteering or if they have a career in their social life with their friends or relationships with family members. One thing that we do see is this disengagement as a person's kind of making the realization, hey, I'm kind of coming at the end of my life here. And so this can be really scary for some people. This is something that we have to really make sure that a person isn't actually engaging, is actually experiencing depression, because sometimes that can happen. They say, well, I'm 80 years old and all of my friends have died, my spouse has died, and I feel like, I'm not doing anything. So we just, you do have to be careful that a person isn't kind of going into despair mode. One thing that's really interesting is that Erik Erikson is has some really interesting theories about development. And one thing that he talked about is this idea of ego integrity. And so Erikson basically labeled ego integrity as the feeling that one's life has been meaningful. And so if you look back on your life and you're happy with what you did, if you enjoyed your life and say, I feel satisfied and I feel good, then, what we find is that people tend to have a much more happier outlook on their lives and even on their death. And so, on the flip side of this, if you're looking back on your life and you're seeing a lot of regrets, if you're bitter, if you see a lot of missed opportunity, then a person's going to feel a lot more times feelings of despair. And so one thing to make sure that a person has a good quality of life is to lead a meaningful life. And so as you age, looking back on what you've done is a really big, important aspect of your development. And so we're continuing to hit milestones in development, even all the way through to our last years of life. Now, the last thing I want to cover is just dying and death. And this is just kind of that, going full circle to the end. Generally speaking, people, once they hit middle adulthood, they might start to get some anxiety about dying. They feel like I'm aging, I'm getting older. As they get into late adulthood, this anxiety may increase. There are these 5 stages. Kubler-Ross wrote several books on these 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There's a video here from Teen Titans Go. It's a silly little video, but it actually does go through the 5 stages pretty well. So Kubler-Ross wrote about these stages of dying, but the problem is that there's a lot of critiques behind these stages because not everybody goes through them. They're not universally demonstrated. Not everybody in the world is going to go through the 5 stages of grief or 5 stages of dying when anything ever happens. They're not necessarily predictable. Dying is a very individual process. This is something that is specific to an individual. Some people accept it immediately and don't have to go through all these different stages here. They just immediately say, okay, this is what it is, and this is how it's going to go. Not everybody, gets mad or gets angry or gets in denial about it. And so this is an interesting kind of idea here, but what's important is to remember that the process of coming to terms with one's own life and death is very much an individual thing. Finally, this is just a review slide for you guys to go back over to help categorize and organize your notes. If you have any questions, you know that you can email me. There is a quiz associated with this chapter, so please make sure that you go over your notes and make sure that if you have any questions, let me know. And we will see you next time.